I betrayed everything, my marriage, my values, my sanity, for a moment that I let become more. I thought it was connection. I thought it was purpose. But now all I feel is sick. I crossed a line with someone I should have protected, not desired. And for what? To feel wanted? To escape being invisible? I discussed myself. I destroyed trust. And for what? A stolen night I can never take back. I see it now, too late. I just wanted to help. That's all it was supposed to be. Charlie had been drifting since college, bright, thoughtful, but weighed down by something unspoken. His father, my husband, barely noticed, but I did. I saw the flickers of frustration, the restlessness behind his quiet eyes, and I felt this pull, maternal. I told myself, protective. So when the leadership summit in Barcelona came up, I extended the invitation lightly over dinner, barely looking up from my wine glass. Come with me, I said. It'll be good for you to see how the world works. He hesitated, just for a second, but in that moment, I saw it, something shift in him. A glint of curiosity, or maybe relief. Like he'd been waiting for someone to finally see him. And when he said yes, when I watched that tentative hope bloom behind his smile, something unfamiliar sparked in me. A flicker of excitement I hadn't felt in years. Not because of where we were going, but because of who was coming with me. I buried it deep, told myself it was nothing. Just the thrill of giving someone purpose. But somewhere inside, the truth was already pressing at the edges. This wasn't going to be just a trip. The airport felt like a beginning, not just of the trip, but of something unspoken stretching between us. Taut and unacknowledged, Charlie walked beside me, his duffel slung over one shoulder. Hair mussed from the early morning rush. There was a quiet in him I couldn't quite place, but I felt it echoing in my chest. Maybe it was nerves, maybe it was anticipation, maybe it was the fact that we were leaving behind everything that defined us and stepping into a space where the lines blurred. Just enough to make you forget which ones mattered. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated on our latest stories. First class check-in, priority boarding, warm smiles from the flight attendants. It was all part of the polished world I lived in. And I could feel him soaking it in. Curious, respectful, just a touch unsure. I liked seeing him like that, on the edge of becoming something more. When we settled into our seats, he glanced at me and gave a soft smile. This is something else. His voice was low, thoughtful. I smiled back. You'll get used to it. But I wasn't used to the way his knee brushed against mine in that narrow space. I wasn't used to the flicker of heat it sent through me, unwelcome. Sharp, real. I told myself it was proximity, cabin pressure, nothing more, except everything in my body said otherwise. The plane rolled down the runway, smooth and powerful beneath us. And then we lifted, weightless, untethered, breaking free. I turned to check on him just as he was watching me. And for a second we both looked away too fast. It felt charged, too much. Champagne arrived in tall, thin glasses. I watched the way his fingers curved around the stem, how his throat moved when he drank. My skin felt too tight. I shifted in my seat. So, I said, forcing a steady tone, tell me what you're hoping to get from this trip. Charlie leaned back, thoughtful, perspective, maybe, direction. I'm tired of feeling stuck. He looked at me then, really looked. I guess I just want to feel like I'm going somewhere. I nodded, something tender and dangerous blooming in my chest. You are. He didn't respond right away. Just held my gaze a second longer than necessary. It made my breath catch. My lips parted, maybe to change the subject. Maybe to escape the gravity of that moment. But the words didn't come. Outside the window, the sky darkened into velvet. Inside, everything softened, the lights, the noise, the boundaries, and then, turbulence, a sudden jolt. Nothing serious, but enough to make his hand reach for something to hold. It found mine. It was instinct. It was comfort. It was a mistake. But I didn't let go. I should have. God, I should have. Instead, I looked down at our hands. His thumb unconsciously stroking the edge of mine. And I felt the heat bloom low in my belly, quiet and aching and undeniable. I turned to him slowly. He was watching me, and in that look, everything we hadn't said yet crackled between us like lightning waiting to strike. And I knew, this trip had already begun. But something else had too. The cabin had dimmed to that soft, dreamlike glow reserved for long-haul flights, where time stretches and everything feels suspended. People around us murmured quietly or tucked under blankets, lost in movies, books, sleep, but not us. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even pretend. Charlie had shifted subtly closer after dinner. Not overtly, not inappropriate, just less space than there had been before. His arm near mine on the armrest. His leg aligned with mine in that narrow space between wide leather seats. We weren't touching, but the awareness was blistering. "This is nice," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His head turned toward me. I looked at him, surprised. "Flying first class?" He shook his head, eyes steady. "No, being here with you." My breath caught, because I felt it too. Not just the thrill of luxury or escape, but this pull, this sense that something unspoken had taken root in the silence between us. I should have shut it down, made a joke, a reminder, something to draw that line. But I didn't. Instead, I looked away and whispered, "Try to get some rest." He nodded, but neither of us moved. The tension hung there, thick, invisible, pulsing. A low rumble shook the plane. A ripple of turbulence far gentler than the first. But it made me flinch. My nerves on edge, not from fear, but from everything else. Charlie's hand brushed my thigh. Just for balance, just for a moment. But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like a threshold. I didn't pull away. And when I turned to him, heart pounding beneath the silk of my blouse, I saw it in his eyes, that same fire. Restrained but restless. He wasn't a boy anymore. And in that moment, I wasn't just a guide or mentor. I was something else. The overhead light glinted off his jawline, shadowed just enough to make his expression unreadable. But the heat between us? That was clear. "I can't sleep," he said softly, after a long stretch of silence. I swallowed, forcing a small, calm smile. "Jet lag." His eyes stayed on me. "It's not that." And I knew. It wasn't the flight. It wasn't the time zone. It was me. It was us. The air around us felt heavy, humid, charged with something fragile and dangerous and beautiful. I turned toward the window, pretending to settle in, eyes closing, but all I could feel was his nearness. The way his breath slowed, thick and measured, the faint, electric hum of his presence. I told myself it was the altitude, the champagne, the exhaustion, but the truth was louder in my chest than I could bear. I wanted him to touch me again. I wanted to touch him back. And I didn't know how much longer either of us could pretend. Not with the dark sky stretched out before us. Not when we were floating above everything we'd ever known. And slipping into something we could never undo. Barcelona wrapped around us like a secret. The city hummed outside the car window, cobblestone streets glowing under golden streetlights. The air thick with the scent of salt and stone and something just shy of summer. Charlie sat beside me in the back seat, his hand resting casually on his knee, fingers drumming with a rhythm that betrayed his nerves. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. His jaw was set, his profile soft in the dark. He looked older tonight, more sure of himself. And yet I could feel the flicker of unease just beneath the surface. I wanted to reach out, to say something reassuring, but I didn't trust my voice. The hotel rose like a jewel in the heart of the Gothic quarter, modern lines wrapped in soft amber light. Discreet and elegant, the concierge greeted us with that polished European charm, handing over 2 key cards with a practiced smile. "Adjacent suites, as requested," she said. Charlie glanced at me, just briefly, his lips pressing into a line that could have meant anything. But the heat that passed between us in that look? It wasn't imagined. Upstairs, the room was bathed in quiet luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, where flickering lights danced over red rooftops and ancient stone. The air was still, heavy with anticipation. "This is incredible," he said, standing in the doorway, his bag still hanging from one shoulder. I nodded. "Enjoy it while you can. Tomorrow's a long day." He lingered. I could feel him behind me as I stepped toward the glass, pretending to be interested in the view, pretending not to notice the way my body was aware of every inch of his presence. "You should get some rest," I said softly. His breath caught, just barely. "Yeah, good night." I didn't turn. I just listened to the soft click of the door as it closed behind him, and released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But I couldn't relax. The silence pressed in as I slowly undressed, the zipper of my dress catching, snagging just between my shoulder blades. I reached back, twisting, struggling, nothing. The fabric resisted, clinging to my skin like it didn't want to be removed. A sharp sigh escaped my lips. I hesitated, staring at the connecting door. Then, before I could overthink it, I knocked. The door opened, and there he was, hair tousled, barefoot, dress shirt undone at the collar. His eyes moved over me, slow and unreadable. "I need a favor," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "The zipper. It stuck." He stepped forward, hesitant but composed. "Turn around." I did. His fingers touched my back. Careful and warm, he worked the zipper slowly, delicately, like he was afraid of breaking something more than just fabric. His breath hit my shoulder. My skin prickled. "There," he whispered. I didn't move. I couldn't. I turned halfway, eyes meeting his, and for a moment, the whole city disappeared, and in the silence between us, something dangerous began to bloom. I closed the bathroom door behind me, slowly, as if slowness might somehow ease the pounding in my chest. Steam clung to the mirror, curling into the air like a secret I couldn't contain. I stared at my reflection, cheeks flushed, lips parted, skin still tingling where Charlie's fingers had brushed the zipper down. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But the truth burned hotter than the water still misting from the shower. The way his touch had lingered, the pause before he stepped away. He had felt it, just like I did. I stepped under the spray, letting the heat wash over me, but it couldn't erase the sensation of his breath on my shoulder. I tilted my head back, closed my eyes, tried to breathe, but the water was no match for memory. I could still feel the drag of his knuckles along my spine. Still see the way his eyes had locked onto mine, uncertain. But hungry. By the time I dried off and slipped into the plush robe, my skin was warm, but my thoughts were restless. I walked to the window. Barcelona glittering beneath me, the city alive with movement, temptation, possibility. I touched the glass, grounding myself. I wasn't this woman. I didn't lose control. I didn't blur lines. But something was already unraveling. A soft knock at the connecting door startled me. I froze. One knock, then silence. I moved to the door slowly, each step heavier than the last. When I opened it, Charlie stood there, hair damp, sleeves rolled, eyes searching. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "No, not really." He hesitated, hands in his pockets, then glanced behind me toward the room. I wasn't sure if I should knock. "You shouldn't have," I said gently, but I didn't close the door. I couldn't. "I know." He paused, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. My breath caught. I swallowed hard. "About what?" He stepped a little closer. "About you. The look in your eyes when I was behind you. The way you didn't move." I looked away, shame blooming hot in my chest. "Charlie, we have to talk about it," he said. "We can't pretend it didn't happen." I lifted my chin, met his gaze. "You're right." We stood in silence, the air between us thick, pulsing. "I don't know what's happening," I admitted. "I just know it feels real. And it scares me." He nodded slowly. "Me too." And then, before either of us moved again, he reached out, tentative, respectful, fingers just grazing the back of my hand. I didn't pull away, and that quiet touch, so innocent and full of ache, shattered whatever boundary we thought we still had. Because for the first time, we weren't hiding from it. We were talking about it. We were acknowledging the storm already rising between us. And now, there was no going back. His lips had barely left mine. But the imprint felt deep, deeper than I expected. Deeper than I was ready to admit. My breath came in shallow pulses, chest rising and falling under the weight of what we'd just done. One kiss, that was all. One soft, hesitant brush of mouths, but it wasn't innocent. It was loaded. Charlie's forehead rested against mine, his fingers still cradling my jaw, like I might disappear if he let go. I could feel the tension in his body, every muscle alert, restrained. I wasn't the only one trying to hold the line that had already been crossed. "Tell me to stop," he whispered again. My eyes fluttered open. I looked at him, really looked, and saw every emotion mirrored back at me. Longing, Confusion, guilt, and something rawer. Something desperate. I breathed. I should tell you to stop. But you don't want to. I couldn't lie. Not to him. Not to myself. So I said nothing. My silence was its own confession. He leaned in, his lips brushing the corner of my mouth. Slow, reverent. His hand slipped from my jaw down to my waist, grounding me. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. I've tried not to feel this, he murmured, since the moment we boarded that plane. I know, I whispered. Me too. My robe slipped slightly as I turned, the soft fabric sliding over my shoulder. His eyes flicked down, then back to mine, his restraint palpable. It wasn't just lust. It was need, the kind that grew in silence and bloomed in moments just like this. Charlie? I said his name like a warning, but it came out like a prayer. I'm not trying to hurt you, he said quickly, or make you do something you'll regret. But if this means something to you. It does, I interrupted. The truth slipped out, stark and undeniable. That's what makes it dangerous. He stepped back a little, his hand dropping, the space between us stretching like a wound. If you want me to go. I reached out before I could think, fingers curling around his shirt. No, don't. His eyes widened, hope flickering beneath the hesitation. I don't know what happens next, I whispered, but I don't want to pretend this didn't happen. Not tonight, not anymore. He exhaled, his whole body softening with my words. Then don't, he said, voice low and steady. Just stay with me in this moment. He drew me closer again. But this time it wasn't rushed. There was reverence in the way his hands found my waist, the way his mouth hovered over mine, waiting, not just for permission, but for connection. When our lips met again, it was slower, deeper, no longer tentative, no longer accidental. We were fully in it now. And even as guilt curled in the corners of my mind, one truth rang louder than the rest. This wasn't just desire. It was us. Undeniable, unspoken, and completely, recklessly real. The sunlight spilled through the curtains in muted gold, softening the sharp edges of reality, but not enough to make me forget. I sat at the edge of the bed, still wrapped in a hotel robe, staring at the empty pillow beside me. It still held the shape of his head, still smelled faintly of him. My heart beat too fast, too heavy, like it didn't know where to settle. The sheets were twisted around my legs, my skin still warm from the memory of his touch. We hadn't said much after. It hadn't felt like there were words big enough for what had happened. Just a whispered, good night, as he quietly slipped back into his room. Barefoot, shirt in his hand, gaze unreadable. I felt like two women. One who wanted to wrap this night in silk and lock it away in her heart. And another who wanted to run to the bathroom, splash cold water on her face, and undo everything that had just occurred. But I couldn't undo it. I had let him in. I had wanted him, and now, the silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was thick with everything we hadn't said. A knock at the door jolted me. I wrapped the robe tighter around myself and crossed the room slowly. Pulse hammering. I half hoped it was room service. I half feared it was Charlie. It was him. He stood there in a plain black t-shirt and jeans, his hair damp from the shower, eyes tired but softer, more open. He looked at me like I was something fragile he didn't know how to hold, but couldn't stop reaching for. Hey, he said, voice low. Hey, I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He moved slowly, carefully, like he didn't want to disrupt anything. We didn't speak at first. He just stood by the window, looking out at the city like he needed a distraction. Then he exhaled, ran a hand through his hair. Are you okay? I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if I was. You? He gave a half laugh, dry and a little broken. I don't know. I keep replaying everything in my head. It doesn't feel real. It was, I said quietly. Too real. He turned to face me. Are you ashamed of what we did? The question hit harder than I expected. I'm ashamed of why I let it happen. I admitted. I was vulnerable, lonely, and maybe I saw something in you I needed to feel again, something alive. He stepped closer, eyes searching mine. I didn't do this to take advantage of you. I know that, I whispered, but that doesn't make it easier. A silence stretched between us. But this time it wasn't empty. It was full of emotion, raw, uncertain, honest. I don't regret you, he said finally. Whatever this is, it's not just a mistake. And as I looked at him, his sincerity, his openness, I realized something terrifying and beautiful. I didn't regret him either. Not even a little. And that changed everything. We sat across from each other at the small table in the corner of my suite. Untouched coffee cooling between us. I had thrown on slacks and a silk blouse, trying to look composed, but everything in me was unraveling quietly. Charlie looked just as torn, his posture tense. His jaw clenched every time our eyes met. The city was waking up outside the window. But in here, we were still wrapped in the night before. I don't know how we're supposed to act now, he said, finally breaking the silence. My throat tightened. Like it didn't happen? His eyes flicked up to meet mine, sharp and pained. But it did. He was right. The truth of it lingered in every muscle of my body. In the taste of him still on my lips. In the way my skin remembered his hands. It was impossible to pretend otherwise. We crossed a line. I whispered. A huge one. Charlie leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands folded like he was anchoring himself. Then talk to me. Really talk to me. We can't just let it sit between us like a secret that's too heavy to carry. I swallowed hard, staring at the way his fingers flexed, the tension rolling through his arms. I wanted it, I admitted. That's the part that makes it worse. I wasn't swept up. I chose it, every second of it. His shoulders dropped, just slightly, like the truth gave him room to breathe. So did I, he said. But not just because of lust. I've felt something for a while. Something I couldn't say out loud. The confession stilled me. It started with admiration. He continued. How you handle things. How you see people. Then it became something else. Something I didn't know what to do with. I looked down at my hands. And I was too lonely to stop it. I've been invisible in my own marriage. Tired of being needed but never wanted. His voice softened. You were wanted. Last night, it wasn't just about sex. It was about being seen. Both of us. Tears burned at the back of my eyes. And I blinked them away. That doesn't make it right. No, he said, reaching slowly across the table. His fingers grazed mine. But it makes it real. The contact was brief. But enough. Enough to remind me that I wasn't just dealing with a moment of weakness, I was dealing with something alive. Still breathing between us. Still growing. We need to be careful, I said, pulling my hand back. This isn't just a fling. It's complicated. And dangerous. I know, he said, but I'm not ready to let it go. Not if it meant something to you too. It had. God help me. It had meant everything. And as we sat there, silent again, the truth hung in the air like a storm cloud, close, heavy, waiting to break. Neither of us knew what came next. But we both knew we couldn't go back. I sat on the edge of the bed long after Charlie left. My hands in my lap, staring at the door like it might open again. But it didn't. And maybe that was for the best. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the city below. Barcelona was alive, brilliant and unbothered. But inside me, the stillness felt unbearable. My skin was too aware. My body ached in places I didn't know could ache from memory alone. I could still feel the shape of his mouth against my neck. The heat of his breath. The way his fingers trembled when I let him pull me closer. But now the space between us had become unbearable in a new way. I reached for my phone. A dozen messages blinked on the screen, emails, meeting reminders, a text from my husband. Hope the flight went well. Let me know how the summit starts. The words felt distant, flat, like they belonged to a version of me I couldn't step back into. I stared at them until they blurred, my thumb hovering above the reply button. But I couldn't bring myself to type a single word. Because I wasn't the same woman who left home. There was a knock at the door again, gentle, uncertain. My breath caught. I stood slowly, half afraid of what I hoped for. When I opened it, Charlie stood there, jacket in hand, expression cautious. I just wanted to say goodbye, he said. For now. I swallowed, nodding. Flight leaves tonight? He nodded too, then hesitated. I thought about staying, but I think space might help. I stepped into the hallway, the cool air brushing against my bare arms. Maybe it will, or maybe it'll make it worse. I don't know what this is, he said, but I don't want to treat it like it meant nothing. My chest tightened. It didn't. The silence between us said all the rest. Every word we were too scared to speak. Every feeling that had gone too far to be undone. His eyes searched mine. If you tell me this ends here, I'll respect it. My mouth opened, but I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know how to walk away from someone who had already seen through every layer I'd kept hidden. I didn't know how to forget the way his body felt against mine, honest. Reverent. Real. I can't promise anything, I said at last. But I also can't lie. You've changed something in me. He nodded slowly. You changed something in me too. Then, without touching, without another kiss, he turned and walked down the hallway. And I stood there, heart thundering in my chest, knowing two things for certain. We had crossed a line. And neither of us would ever be able to uncross it. The apartment felt unfamiliar when I stepped through the door. Colder, quieter, even though everything was exactly where I had left it. Something had shifted. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was what I had brought back with me, a secret that lived beneath my skin. Humming softly like a second heartbeat. My husband greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and a distracted, "How was the trip?" before turning back to whatever he was watching on his laptop. I gave him the summary he expected: productive meetings, great turnout, smooth flights, lies dressed in professionalism. I didn't mention Charlie, didn't say his name, didn't describe the way his fingers had lingered at my waist, didn't confess how the line between us had disappeared like mist under morning light. That night, I lay in bed beside the man I had promised to love, while my mind drifted to the one I should never have touched. Sleep didn't come easily. A message blinked on my phone just past midnight. I rolled over slowly, heart pounding before I even saw it. "Charlie, I can't stop thinking about you." I stared at it for a long time, the words echoing inside me louder than any spoken truth. I should have turned the phone off. I should have deleted the message. But instead, I typed, "I know, I feel it too." The reply came almost instantly. "I'm coming home tomorrow." And just like that, the air in the room changed. I wasn't alone in my guilt anymore. It wasn't just memory, it was imminent. And real. And dangerously close. The next day passed in a blur. My husband was busy, as always. We exchanged words like colleagues. Brief and efficient. But even as I made dinner, folded clothes, smiled on cue, my body was elsewhere. My thoughts were still wrapped in hotel sheets. Still tasting Charlie's name on my lips. That evening, I heard the front door open. A suitcase wheel dragged across the hardwood. He was here. I stepped out of the kitchen just in time to see him set his bag down. His eyes met mine, flicking briefly to where my husband sat on the couch, then back to me. We didn't speak. We didn't need to, because something passed between us in that glance, a flash of everything unspoken. Everything forbidden, desire, guilt, longing, and something darker, the realization that what we started wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Later that night, I found a note slipped into the pocket of my coat. His handwriting, simple, careful. "We still need to talk. I'm not letting this fade into silence." I pressed the note to my chest, closed my eyes, and let the weight of it sink in. Because silence wouldn't protect us anymore. And hiding from this would only make it harder to stop. In today's world, where loneliness hides behind busy schedules and emotional needs often go unmet, it's easy to blur lines when someone finally sees you, listens, or makes you feel alive again. But desire born in vulnerability can lead to choices that unravel more than just hearts. The lesson here isn't just about temptation, it's about communication. Speak your truth before it becomes a secret. Don't let silence build intimacy where honesty should stand. If something's missing in your life or your relationship, name it. Don't wait until it's too late and connection finds you in the arms of someone it never should have.